Welcome to PharmacyToDose, the critical care podcast. We're discussing critical care and its pharmacotherapy in a fun and entertaining manner. Each episode, we summarize the available evidence, discuss controversial issues, provide practical take-home points with a subject matter expert. And I'm your host, Nick Peters. And wherever you are and however you are listening, thank you. I want to do just a quick check-in on our Pharmacy to Read book club members. Reminder, our first book we are reading is 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos by Jordan Peterson. Now, if you haven't got the book or haven't started reading yet, you're definitely not behind, but just keep in mind we'll start discussing the book sometime in March, so definitely get to reading or listening if you're interested in participating. Now, last episode, we were honestly privileged to be joined by Jimmy Hatton Kolpick discussing post-intensive care syndrome. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, please do. I'd recommend you pause this and kind of go back. It's a really fantastic precursor to the discussion we're going to have today. And I'm joined by an extremely special guest and friend of the pod, Morgan Jones. Now, Morgan Jones has been a clinical pharmacy specialist in neurocritical care at Methodist University Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee for the last 9 years. He also serves as the PGY2 Critical Care Residency Program Director and is an assistant professor in the departments of clinical pharmacy, neurology, and neurosurgery at the University of Tennessee Health Science. He graduated from the University of Louisiana at Monroe in 2009 and completed PGY1 and PGY2 critical care pharmacy training at The Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. He was inducted as a fellow in the Society of Critical Care Medicine and will also be one of the co-authors on the upcoming Neurocritical Care Society Cerebral Edema Guidelines that will be published in a few months this year. More recently, Morgan's role at Methodist has expanded, and he now also serves as a clinical pharmacy coordinator of postgraduate education and training, in addition to his patient care responsibilities. Wow, Morgan, with all you do, I really appreciate you making the time and coming on today, so thank you.
No, thanks, Nick, for the opportunity. I definitely want to note for anybody who makes fun of me for you calling it The Ohio State University, that was not in the bio I gave you. You do that in anecdote. I like it, though.
I will just say it's in the bio. I'm looking right at it, and I was going to give you a hard time about it. I was going to give you a hard time.
Yeah. I don't think I capitalized it, so in my mind, that means we weren't emphasizing it in the same way. But yeah,
I
it's definitely
know
something you pick up on your time there.
If the Buckeyes are very sensitive to the these, so I wanted to be sure if it was in there that I put the proper emphasis on the right syllable, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I think many of the listeners have kind of found a theme in some of my opening questions. You know, I love going to new cities and definitely eating some of their famous food. And when I think of Tennessee cuisine, I think the absolute first thing I think about is Memphis barbecue. So, you know, what are your go-to spots when you're in the mood, or, you know, where do you recommend family or friends if they ask for your advice on where to go?
Well, anybody who comes to Memphis knows that there is no shortage on high-quality food in this area. It's probably why we keep jumping between 1 and 2 on the second most obese city in the United States list. My wife and I have actually worked to kind of settle this argument in a pretty unique way with some of our friends, and we did it with our residents last year for their Christmas party, where we actually have gotten different barbecue restaurants from around the city, blinded them, had people eat, taste, and then vote for their favorites. So I've done that 3 times with some of my friends here. The first 2 times, the same place won. It's down the street from me. It's called the Germantown Commissary. It's actually kind of in a little shack. It's become the best barbecue you'll ever have. They opened a new restaurant that's much bigger and nicer in Collierville, Tennessee, which is just another suburb a few miles away from me. But this last time we did it with the residents, we put Central Barbecue, Germantown Commissary, and then a place in Midtown called the Barbecue Shop up head-to-head. And most people who come to Memphis are told that Central is the best. And I kind of found it interesting with our whole class of 15 residents and some preceptors, that actually was everybody's least favorite, and the Barbecue Shop kind of won the head-to-head with the Germantown Commissary. So I would say if you're here, definitely try them all, but the Barbecue Shop and the Germantown Commissary are definitely my favorites.
What a great idea of kind of doing like a taste test. That's so perfect. And it seems like a universal truth that some of the best foods are just in, shacks or hole in the walls because they're not spending
Yep,
money on anything else but that delicious food.
absolutely.
So you went to pharmacy school in Louisiana and then completed your residencies in Ohio, but where are you from originally?
So I've kind of been a little bit all over the South. I grew up just north of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in a really small town. And then I was 14. We moved to Franklinton, Louisiana, which is just another really small town. It's about 60 miles northeast of New Orleans. So because I grew up in small towns, the kind where if you wanted to go to Walmart on the weekend, you had to plan a whole day trip to go there. I knew I didn't want to go to school at any place like that. So I went to pharmacy school in Monroe, Louisiana, which for me was a huge city since it was about 65, 70,000 people. But for anybody else who doesn't know anything about Monroe, Louisiana, it's where they shot the show Duck Dynasty. So that should actually tell you a lot about where I went to college. After that, I knew I wanted to get out of the South to see pharmacy practice in a different area. And the match took me to Ohio State, and I absolutely loved my 2 years there in Columbus. Since my wife is from Wisconsin, I think we had hoped to kind of stay in the Midwest, but as you know, when residency ends, you go where the jobs are, and that's what brought us back south to Memphis.
Duck Dynasty was so popular. I'd be really curious if there are like students or residents listening, if they even know that reference. I think a lot of us do, but like Duck Dynasty was in terms of reality TV, it was almost a game changer, and it really gives a perspective on where you're from. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, my attending when I first started my job here made a joke about Seinfeld one day, and all the med students looked at him and had no idea what Seinfeld was, and I realized at that moment that we were both old.
Now that's the saddest thing I've heard, because hopefully all the listeners know I'm extremely pro Seinfeld. So that's tough. Now, how did you and your wife meet?
I always kind of joke with my wife and the people who know us well that one day they're going to put us in a really cheesy recruitment video, but we actually met at an APHA meeting when we were both students. I was at ULM and she was a year ahead of me at Creighton in Omaha. We met at a meeting, and then, this was back in the days before you had unlimited cell phone minutes. So after a few months of me getting in a lot of trouble with my parents because I was burning through all their minutes, randomly bought a plane ticket to Omaha on New Year's Eve. I bought it on New Year's Eve, and then I flew up there later that month, and we've pretty much been together ever since. She did her AmCare residency in North Carolina while I was on final year APPE rotations. When I matched at Ohio State, she moved there and got a job working at OSU, and then eventually doing anti-coag at another hospital in Columbus. We actually got married in Columbus, so that's probably why that city will always feel a little bit like home to me. Now, we've been in Memphis, like I said, 9 years. We have two boys. Hudson turns 4 in March, and Parker is 18 months. So there's never a shortage of excitement in my house, never a slow moment when those two are awake, and they take up pretty much all my time when I'm not working.
What a great story, and shout out to the Creighton Blue Jays, kind of in the Midwest. Now, in the episode introduction, I kind of mentioned that if you didn't listen to the previous episode, you should definitely do that, because this is kind of the first. It's like a 2-episode series, and we were lucky enough to have Jimmy come on, kind of discussing the clinical side of PICS. And now, kind of for the second part, so I emailed Morgan kind of at the beginning of November of 2019 to kind of gauge if he would be interested in being a guest for a future podcast episode, and his response back with his idea and his thought was both heartbreaking and incredibly inspiring. So Morgan, why are you here with me today?
Yeah, admittedly, when you first reached out to me, I honestly wasn't sure I was going to say yes to doing this. One, yours is the first podcast I ever listened to, so maybe it's fate from that perspective. I just never really got into podcasts. I've always been a big music person, and during my 30 minutes to and from work every day, music has always been my outlet to handle stress, so that's what I spent my time doing in the car. I'd listened a few times and listened to some people I knew well, give some great talks with you, and dive into some clinical controversies. For me, I've been practicing about 10 years now, and I find myself being at this place where I'm trying to be a lot more selective with how I spend my time. Just trying to do things that I could see having a lot bigger impact. Now, don't get me wrong, and everybody who knows me knows that I could sit here and talk about ICP management or intracerebral hemorrhage or anticoagulation reversal all day long. But I think I kind of knew deep down the second that I read your email that there was really only one thing that I could talk about that could really have the impact that I wanted. I just wasn't really sure if I was ready. You and I did that first follow-up phone call to kind of let me gauge my comfort level with you. I talked to my doctor, and then I decided that it was time to start opening up about the things that I've been through over the last 7 years as a result of watching someone I love go through an incredibly challenging trauma. Here we go. On March 1st, 2013, I dropped my wife off at the airport to go on a cruise with her sister. And before we could get out of the unload lane at the airport, she was leaning into the back of my car to put a pair of shoes in her suitcase when a taxi cab driver barreled into the back of my car at about 30 miles an hour, pinning her in between. What happened over the subsequent minutes, hours, days, and the 7 years since have completely changed every aspect of my life in ways that I can't even sometimes wrap my head around. My wife spent 44 days in the hospital, had 7 total surgeries, spent a year in rehab pretty much outpatient, and has permanent injuries as a result of her accident. What makes it even more complicating is 4.5 years later, on November 17th, 2017, the nightmare happened all over again when a car ran over my 18-year-old son and broke both of his legs and his pelvis. About a year ago, I finally decided that I had to accept how much witnessing both of these traumas and the subsequent hospitalizations and the things that happened had an impact on me. So I reached out for help. I started seeing a psychologist, and it resulted in what I thought was coming, which was being told that I had classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that I was one of those 1 in 3 family members that develop some sort of mental health condition after their loved one is discharged from the ICU or the hospital.
Did a lot of what Jimmy kind of talked about, did any of that hit home with you or capture some of the feelings and things that you experienced?
Oh, 100%. It was almost like Jimmy took the thoughts right out of my head at times. And I think it's important for anybody who's listening to know that Jimmy and I don't know each other. The 3 of us conceived this idea together, but the reality is I had no idea what Jimmy was going to say, and it was almost like having my mind read at times. I think it just shows how common some of the things that I dealt with and still deal with today are for families. The simple fact that 1 out of every 4 family members may go through what I'm going through right now, it's just alarming to me. I can be a resident. I can remember being a resident and being taught about all these concepts that we're going to talk about today or that Jimmy talked about, and reading about how interventions can sometimes cause patients to have long-term consequences. But I never learned about the impact on their families. Now that I've lived through the last 7 years, Jimmy is absolutely right that we need better tools to help us as clinicians understand families and what they need from us on a daily basis. The one thing that she said that really just struck a chord with me, and I thought was so beautifully said, was that we have to understand that saving someone's life is only step 1. And I'm not sure right now that that's a concept that's taught across medical training in America today.
So can you remember a lot of the details kind of from the days leading up to and kind of the actual events kind of surrounding your wife's accident?
Yeah, I remember one time when I was a resident reading this article that said that people who go through trauma undergo such a rush of hormones and catecholamines that it oftentimes allows their brain to cement the memories more permanently. For me, it's almost like every detail of that day is just tattooed on my brain. It was March 1st, so it was the first day of brand new resident rotations at work. I remember the resident I had on rotation. I had just finished orienting her to the rotation. We'd just finished rounds. I told her I was going to leave the hospital quickly for about 30 minutes to run my wife to the airport, drop her off, and come right back, and we would do our topic discussion on neuroanatomy and ICP control. My wife, like I said, had planned a cruise with her sister and her niece, and it was a trip she was really looking forward to because there was a lot of stress going on in her job, and she just wanted to get away. I think like us all when we go on vacation. We drove up to the drop-off lane at the airport. I got out to unload her bags. I went to pull it out of the back, and she said, "Hey, I want to put my shoes in it. Don't do that." So she was on her tiptoes putting her shoes into the suitcase, and I remember my phone vibrating, and picked it up to read a text, and I stepped a few feet away from her. As I turned back around to ask her if she was done, I saw the cap coming out of the corner of my eye. All I could do in that moment was let out a yell. But at that moment, the car collided with the back of mine and pinned my wife in between and only missed me by a few feet.
So what happened in the immediate aftermath of the accident?
Immediately, I remember trying to just get to my wife. The problem was that I couldn't because the taxi cab and my car were almost still connected with her in between. So some of the ticket counter workers from outside the Delta terminal came up and helped me pull the two cars apart. And I just grabbed my wife and I pulled her to the ground and just wanted to make sure she was okay. At that moment, I can remember feeling like time was very still. But I looked up and noticed blood everywhere. I could pretty much see that her leg was barely attached to her body. And it only took me about 30 seconds of panic in that moment to have the medical part of my mind kick in. And maybe it's because I work in neuro, but my mind immediately went to wondering about her neck and her spine. And so I just remember talking to her, trying to tell her to be still, don't move. Trying to say EMS will be here soon, it's going to be okay. You know, in that moment, you try to find an ability to be strong, but I could see everything and I knew how bad it was. I just wanted her to know what to expect when people got there because I feel like sometimes if we know what to expect, even when we know the outcome is bad, it helps us to better deal with that. The one thing I remember most about lying on the ground with her was she looked up at me with such a sense of calm, and she just said, "I'm not going on my cruise, am I?" It's a moment that I'll probably never be able to forget the rest of my life. Once EMS got there, things happened very quickly. They stabilized her, got her onto a gurney into the ambulance. At that point, the police wanted to talk to me about as much as possible before I left. When they were ready to take my wife to the hospital, I went to jump into the ambulance, and I remember a police officer grabbing me on the shoulder, telling me that my car was likely drivable, and if I didn't drive it, they were going to tow it, and it would be very challenging for me to get it back. And I just remember thinking, man, the least thing I need right now is to not have a car to be able to drive. So my wife kind of heard this and told me to drive. So I got in the car and I followed the ambulance to the hospital. I think that's an important detail because when I got to the hospital, I didn't know where I was going. I was completely lost. I just wandered the hallways looking. And I remember people staring at me almost, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I finally found the trauma hallway towards the trauma area, and I looked down, and I was covered in blood. And I hadn't even realized it because of everything that had happened. So in that moment, I didn't know where to go or where my wife was, and I had two of the pharmacy residents from this hospital on rotation previously, and I called them, and they took me to the trauma bay to help me find my wife.
So from there, what were some examples of things that didn't go as you would have initially expected?
Nothing, to be honest. Nothing went as I expected. First, I couldn't stay back there with my wife. They would only let me back for 10 or 20 minutes at a time every few hours. The pharmacy residents that I knew, luckily, kind of saw how traumatized I was, and they took me to a private room that was off the back of the trauma area, so I could be alone or with them and kind of collect my thoughts and control myself. Finally, about 2 hours after we got there, a medical resident came out and talked to me. He told me that my wife had floating fractures of her femur, tibia, and fibula. She had extensive damage to her knee as well as significant loss of skin and muscle. Her neck and spine had been cleared. There were still parts of the car inside her leg, and there was a lot of damage to the left side of her body because the bumper had broke and stabbed her on the left side. They called vascular surgery because her pulses were decreased and they needed to be evaluated. She would need an extensive surgery involving orthopedics and plastics that would last anywhere from 12 to 18 hours, and they were prepping her right now and hope to have her back to the OR in the next 2 hours. I remember this because he spoke with such certainty. This is what was going to happen. There was no doubt in his mind. He clearly told me that my wife wouldn't need an external fixator placed, that they would correct everything today by placing rods, and that that would be the biggest thing to help relieve her pain. He walked away, and I felt the sense of relief because I knew what the plan was. Like I said, when we know what's going to happen, it helps relieve the anxiety associated with it. The problem was literally not one thing he said is what happened over the next 12
So
hours.
being the husband and the decision maker, what were some of the biggest failures you witnessed firsthand?
I think the biggest failure, honestly, was how no one seemed to realize how much their words mattered or how they impacted me or my wife. I remember about 2 hours after that resident left, no one had updated me on anything. Then a nurse came in, and I remember very vividly her telling me that no one had come out because there was a more important trauma that had come in. Even saying those words, to be honest, just kind of makes me nauseous because while it may have been true, telling me that someone else is more important than the single most important person to me isn't the way to communicate that a patient in more critical condition came in. I think that's probably one of the best examples I have of how words can land kind of like a punch to the gut sometimes. Then, about 12 hours after the accident, that's how long it took to get into a room. My wife was transferred from the trauma bay to an actual room. We were told the ICU was full, so they were moving us to the step-down unit and treating us as an ICU patient and assured us that we would get the same level and attention as an ICU patient was. This was just after midnight because my wife's accident happened right after noon. And my wife went back for her actual first surgery at 2 a.m. They, did the standard talk with me about, you need to go take care of yourself. We're going to be back in the OR for so long. You should go home and sleep. There's no point in staying here in the hospital. We lived, a good 40 minutes from downtown where we were at. So I called our current critical care resident at 2 a.m. and went and slept in his spare bedroom thinking that I was going to be there a few hours and I could wrap my head around everything that had happened. I think I'd been asleep maybe 90 minutes when I got a phone call from the hospital that, sent me into a state of panic. My wife was out of surgery and she was back in the room. No idea why the surgery didn't take as long. All I was told was she was back in the room. I got dressed, went to the hospital as fast as I could, and I remember walking into the room just seeing my wife in a complete state of panic, being restrained by multiple nurses. She woke up. There was an external fixator from her hip to her ankle, and she was screaming in pain. We had been prepared mentally for one option by that resident. The exact same things he had told me outside of the trauma bay is what he told my wife in the trauma bay. But then none of it happened. So it made waking up to that, cold reality so much harder. This was just the first day of the nightmare, to be honest. I learned that day just how important it is for medical teams to set proper expectations because some of the worst memories for me are from that day. Walking back into that room and seeing the state of panic she woke up to, the nurse telling me someone else was more important, even the level of arrogance and certainty in the resident's voice, it makes me think sometimes of how rough that first day was, even 7 years later.
The love and compassion from multiple different pharmacy residents, that is really kind of touching to hear that the pharmacy family, even in states of need, kind of come together like this.
Oh, absolutely. We would have never survived any of this without the support of the people we worked with. And that day was also interesting because, we'd only lived in Memphis about a year and a half then. And it's the first year I was mentoring a PGY1. The way our program is set up is each PGY1 gets a personal mentor. And he was the only person I knew to call. He and his girlfriend shared a car at the time, so he literally ran on foot from our hospital to where I was at, which is about a little bit over a mile, in full dress clothes to come sit there with me. So I had somebody and I wasn't alone. So between those three people, they were my rocks that day, and I don't know if I would have gotten through any of the day without them.
Now, how did it feel being on the other side, kind of having your role reversed from, you've been, through residency and even in your practice, right? You were on that medical team, who's delivering that information, to now kind of, interacting with them and receiving the information, especially with having a medical and trauma background. Did that change anything?
For me, I tried to be aware of my role, which was to be a family member. I used to always tell myself to take my clinical pharmacy hat off and put my patient hat on or family member hat on. And I tried really hard to do that because I wanted to let the medical team do their thing, to follow their protocols, and to not simultaneously force myself into their decision-making process. I just mainly wanted information to know how they made their decisions. I asked a lot of questions about pain because that was our biggest issue at the beginning, and I really wanted them to address that because I knew the consequences of uncontrolled pain. I knew that years down the road, our life was harder if they didn't do their diligence now to make sure her pain was controlled. It was kind of that dance that you get when you're admitted to one team trauma, but the other teams are consulted and they're managing most of things. So nobody really wanted to write pain orders except for trauma, and they kept saying that surgery would fix the pain. But the problem was surgery didn't come fast. Um, I also kind of kept relaying to them that my wife had numerous surgeries in the past, and we knew she kind of didn't respond well to standard doses of opioids. But it took days for anyone to kind of realize that was the case. Honestly, I felt like the response I received when I asked for better communication a lot was, "We're busy here. We have a lot of traumas here." And for me, that was almost just the excuse again that's tattooed onto my brain from the memories. The car had actually done so much damage to my wife's leg that it ended up taking 4 different surgeries to debride everything and to get the dirt and sediment out. Because of that, they were very concerned about doing the open reduction internal fixation because of the infection risk. So every surgery just turned into more washouts and more antibiotic beads. I can remember vividly one night my wife just kept telling me something doesn't feel right. And she was very short of breath and tachycardic. And so she kept asking the nurse to page the team to come see her, and they kept reiterating to us that she didn't meet any of the thresholds for her heart rate, temperature, or respiratory rate for them to page the team. Finally, after me bugging enough, they did, because all I could keep thinking was these doctors have ingrained into my wife and I that her infection risk is super high. And so all I kept doing was counting Sears criteria, getting worried. About 4 hours after the nurse page originally, a resident came by and just completely brushed my concerns aside. I remember not sleeping one single minute that night because I was so worried I was going to wake up and my wife was going to have decompensated. The next day, we figured out something was wrong. She wasn't infected. Her hemoglobin was too low, and so they gave her blood transfusions that corrected all of her symptoms. But we both spent a sleepless night that just set us back further in the hospitalization simply because no one was listening to the concerns we were bringing forward.
So you've already kind of detailed, so many, different failures, from communication to implementation and things. But was there any one, specific thing or moment that stood out as being, different than you expected or harder to handle kind of prior to all of this?
Yeah, it was actually something that Jimmy mentioned that they do in her clinic to try to help patients, which is to try to return control to the patient. This was absolutely the hardest part of the situation for me, the lack of control. I had control over nothing. I couldn't control whether or not my pain was treated effectively. I couldn't control the time of the day the team rounded on us. I couldn't control whether or not our surgeries got bumped or how many other patients my nurse's wife had to care for that day that were sicker than my wife. Because of all of this, I struggled each day to sometimes maintain my own reactions to things because I just felt like my life was completely out of control in that moment. And I know there are days that I wasn't the easiest family member to be around, and I look back on it and wish that it could have been different. But at the same time, I also feel like the situation puts us as family members in a position where it's very challenging to make coherent decisions.
I know I can speak for myself. I think I can definitely think of times, I've thought of family members as being difficult, but I think kind of taking a step back, one thing I think all of us as team members need to remember is, this can obviously be the worst or most traumatic experience of their whole entire life. And, I think that the critical care team focuses on giving the patient the best care possible, or trying to. I think we can't kind of forget about, the stress that the family members are processing and currently dealing with. Because, you just detailed, having, one night where you didn't sleep at all. And I'm sure that's in the case of all of this, I'm sure that's not the only night.
Yeah, I read an article about PICS-F, post-intensive care unit syndrome for families recently, that essentially said that oftentimes family members struggle with life after the ICU or the hospital because they can remember every detail of everything that happened, and that puts stress on them. They also have the stress of what's happening outside of the hospital to deal with, whereas sometimes situations that lead to the patient themselves developing PICS can be related to the fact that they're so medicated or they receive medications that alter their ability to develop memories. And in that moment, some of their stresses can be because they can't remember everything that happened. For me, probably one of the most painful memories to relive was my weakest day in the hospital, which was my wife's accident happened on a Friday, and on a Monday, a resident came into our room at 5 a.m. and said, today's the day for the big surgery, which is exactly what we wanted. The fixator would come off, my wife's pain would be better. But then 3 hours later, a second resident comes in and says, "Oh, we should be taking you back for your washout in about an hour. We'll be back there about 2 hours." My wife and I both immediately said, "What happened? What changed?" And we aggressively wanted more answers. Unfortunately, no one ever came back until 11 a.m. when an OR transporter team came to take my wife back to the OR, and I lost it. I'm just gonna be honest. I wouldn't let them take her. She wouldn't go. We'd not consented for a procedure. We didn't know what procedure was happening. It was just an emotional rock bottom. And I remember walking out into the hallway to just compose myself, to try not to be emotional in front of my wife. And as I walk into the hallway, I hear another nurse who's not caring for my wife tell the OR on the phone that the patient's know-it-all pharmacist husband won't let him take her back to the OR. And I became irate. I'm not proud of how I handled that, but at the same time, it was a situation where um, I got to hear someone else's words, and again, how they landed on me in a way and impacted me that I could never fathom. I think about how many times we say things about patients and their families in the hallway, and I truly wonder what it would be like for that family member to hear it. Actually, I don't have to wonder it. I know what it's like, and it's awful. That situation got worse because the nurse called security on me, and I then had to sit in the floor of my wife's hospital room, emotional, explaining why I was yelling. And that day was just really hard, and it's one I think about often because it's a day I know I could have been better. I could have controlled my emotions better, but I also think sometimes that providers, including me in my job now, pass so much judgment on people during their weakest moments. And I really think this is a time where we should be giving people understanding and empathy and not passing judgment on them.
Well, and it's, for all of us, I think it's so easy to stay focused on our needs during busy days, right? Like you mentioned the day of the accident, you were going to come back to do a topic discussion, right? We need to review
Yep.
a presentation, complete med recs, write PK notes. I mean, the list goes on. And I think that all of us can relate that the days that you probably need to get the most done are always the days where the unit can be the most chaotic. And, there's so many times where just simple communication could change the perspective and all of these things, because I imagine if someone had just simply communicated, things appropriately and let you know what was going to happen, that outburst probably wouldn't have happened. Is that probably a fair assumption?
Oh, absolutely. And the challenging part was after that day, um, I can remember going up to the nurse and hugging her and apologizing and just saying, I'm sorry. And that was a good moment because it gave me a sense of closure for that day. But the problem was everything, Nick, just got harder from that day on. My wife didn't actually have her major surgery until hospital day 12. I remember the day exactly because it was, other than the day of the accident, it was the worst day. By that point, we had transferred to a general ortho floor. And when my wife went back to the OR around 5 that morning, we were told the ICU was full, and so was the step down unit. So it was highly likely she was going to come back to the same bed on the general ortho floor after. They called me and told me the surgery was over around 7 p.m., but I waited for about 3 hours with no update, and my wife still wasn't back in the room. The PACU nurse came with her and told me essentially that they couldn't get her pain controlled, so she hadn't been able to leave the PACU. And so now it's after 10 p.m. My wife's post-op from, I think the surgery ended up being around 13 hours, and she comes back to a floor where the nurse taking care of her has 7 other patients. That was a hard night. When my wife woke up from the sedation they had given her in the PACU, she screamed for hours on end. I asked the nurse over and over to page, the trauma team because they hadn't ordered my wife any additional pain meds on top of what she was already receiving. She was receiving a lot, but again, she now had a surgery and needed something for new acute pain. It was probably like 2:30 or 3 in the morning before the intern came into our room to evaluate my wife. The end result was that intern telling me that it was impossible for my wife to be in as much pain as she was projecting. That if she gave her any more pain meds, she would have to intubate her, put her on the fentanyl drip, and move her to the unit. And she thought a lot of her issues were just anxiety. As I stood in front of the intern that night, I just remember thinking honestly about the sound of my wife's screams as the car hit her and how the screams from that night were just so much worse. That was literally the longest night of my entire life. And it has impacted me in so many ways. I remember when we were having our first son, being terrified of going to the hospital and having to hear my wife be in pain again. These are things you don't think about happening to patients and their families. But that one single night impacted my ability to pretty much be fully present and enjoy the birth of my child because I was so anxious and concerned about my wife having to go through pain again. I think the other biggest challenge was I had to work with that intern to me at work. Every time I would verify an order where I saw her name, if I saw her face in the hallway, it would just paralyze me. I just couldn't do it. It always brought me back to standing in front of her that night, and I'm certain she never realized it was me during the interactions we had. But the one hope that I have today is that she learned something from that interaction that made her be better for someone else in the future.
Now, with all of this going on, how were you able to cope with everything happening, through this and kind of trying to, to manage your, job and all, all the ancillary things that us as the medical team can easily forget? Life doesn't stop.
Yeah, I mean, you already mentioned the support that I mentioned receiving that day. That really continued. The department we worked in, our neighbors, everybody just really, they propped us up and helped us in a way that I never expected. After that, my biggest coping mechanism was I threw myself into work. That may sound kind of odd, but I missed a week of work fully initially, and then fear set in. What if I used up all my PTO? What if I didn't have enough money to pay the mortgage? What if I couldn't pay our student loan bills that were more than my mortgage? I haven't even mentioned yet the stress that was happening outside the hospital by this point. I went home to check my mail about a week after the accident and got served with a lien from the hospital for $250,000. I don't know if any 20-something-year-old knows how to react when they get served with a $250,000 lien, because I sure didn't. In that moment, I started realizing the long-term financial impacts all of this can have on us. Someone else had done this to my wife, and I had people from every direction I knew telling me that I needed to start dealing with that, but it was just something I didn't even want to have to think about. So both my wife and I realized after 5 or 6 days in the hospital that I couldn't spend every night there. We lived about 30 minutes from downtown, and I didn't have an hour to drive back and forth every day. So instead of sleeping at the hospital after that, I started staying at a friend's house to try to focus on myself a little bit, but still spending the morning before work at the hospital with my wife. I would get up about 5, go into the hospital, see her till 6, and then go to work. And then most days I left around noon or stayed a little bit later if I had to. Ironically, that was the most productive academic year of my life. I threw myself into work. I think I published or had 12 papers accepted for publication that year because that was my outlet for control. It was a way that I found to channel my stress into something productive. I could get up every day, go to work, take care of patients, have a good impact on residents, and it would make me, for just a moment, forget about the hell that my life was outside of the hospital.
So when your wife was eventually discharged from the hospital, I think you said she was there for a little over 40 days, maybe 44 days. What happened next?
Well, unfortunately for us, going back home was a long time after the actual hospital discharge. So we spent 28 days at one hospital. Then we went to another hospital that had a long-term acute care unit in it for 16 more days. We had to learn how to function with her leg in an immobilizer for many months, and she also had extensive wound care, and she had more surgeries at the long-term care hospital as well. The experience there was definitely better because they had a pain service that really involved my wife and I in their decisions, and her pain control got significantly better. The problem was that this was the point where the stresses outside of the hospital just reached a level that I can't even wrap my head around sometimes. The bills were coming from the hospitals, and we learned just how complex things are whenever you're involved in a traumatic accident that's someone else's fault. Then, on the morning of my wife's sixth surgery, right before she was going back to the OR, our neighbors called and told us that they saw water rushing out of a drainage pipe in my attic. I told them where the keys to my house were. They ran into my house and discovered that the hot water heater that was in my attic, the pipe running into it had actually burst, and there'd likely been water running into the walls of my house for several days. Ultimately, my house was uninhabitable for nearly 4 months. They pretty much had to rip almost everything on the entire first floor down to the dirt and rebuild it. So not only did I have to worry about what my wife was going through, but I literally had no home to go to anymore once she was discharged. And then by that point, we'd become comfortable with being in the hospital. I know that may sound odd. So going home was actually terrifying. And then we had no home to go to. So on a Tuesday, our social worker told us that our insurance company had decided my wife didn't need to be in the hospital anymore, and that she had spent the day begging for more time and had been given 2 days. So I essentially had 2 days to work with my wife to figure out not only how we would be discharged with all of the rehab and home health we needed, but where were we going to go. That was kind of the moment where, again, my support network kicked in. I was fortunate enough when we moved to Memphis that one of my co-residents from Ohio State works here. She's the director of pharmacy at a children's hospital, and she opened her home to us. It takes a special human being to let other people into their own home and their private space, especially when those two people are literally going through the worst time of their entire life. And so we lived with her for almost 3 months. And I'm incredibly grateful to the sacrifices that she made that allowed us to have a place to go once we got out of the hospital.
Now, how long did you stay at her house?
I think it was just short of 3 months. The problem was we were going back and forth now with the construction company on rebuilding our house. Our insurance company brought in a disaster management team because the damage to our home exceeded six figures. So there was so much that had to be rebuilt and fixed, that every time we were given a day of how long it would take to be fixed, it would take longer. So from my best recollection, we moved back into the house in early July, and my wife's accident happened in March. So it was about just shy of 3 months that we lived with my former co-resident.
So then what happened once you were able to kind of finally come back home and into your own house?
That part was, we were much further out at that point. So by that point, our lives were much more stable. In terms of knowing what part of the plan was. I think the harder part was being discharged and the actual day we left the first time. That day was really hard because we hit some more healthcare barriers. Essentially, the pain team had written a really complex regimen for my wife to be discharged on, and the nurse practitioner for the primary team was very concerned about my wife going home on nearly 500 oral morphine equivalents a day and wouldn't write the prescriptions. And so we had to spend the day begging pretty much to find a provider who, one, could prescribe my wife the medications that were physically just allowing her to wake up every day and function. And then also begging this nurse practitioner to keep an open mind and to at least give us discharge prescriptions so we could get out of the hospital effectively. Unfortunately, we left that day with prescriptions that were only about 50% of what my wife was actually requiring to manage her pain, which made the first few days much more challenging. But we got a follow-up appointment. We finally found the physician who would care for my wife and a very compassionate nurse practitioner who helped manage pain. When we moved back into our house, it was almost just like starting the long process to heal. I remember I made dinner the first night we were there and opened a bottle of wine we bought on our 1 year anniversary when we went to Napa, and it was probably the most expensive bottle of wine I'd ever bought at the time. And I was thinking to myself, there's never been a time like tonight to drink this bottle.
How long would you say until things started feeling somewhat normal again, after your life was literally and figuratively upended?
I don't really know if I know what normal is anymore, Nick. I think you redefine what you think normal is, but I don't know if I remember what feeling like normal was like from before the accident. A few weeks after my wife's accident, I wasn't really sleeping very much. I went and saw a doctor about this, just hoping he would give me some sleeping pills to help me sleep and cope. And after taking some convincing from him, I agreed at that time to take sleeping pills and antidepressants because he felt like that was the thing that I needed. And at the time, I agreed. I think it was a good choice. The problem was, for me, it didn't make me actually deal with the issues I was experiencing. It somewhat just numbed my response to them. And if you read articles about PICS or PICS-F, they talk about how the symptoms can be worsened years down the road if you don't deal with them when they first manifest. So for me, I think now I look back on that and realize that I should have put more time and effort then into my own mental health, and it could potentially have helped me now. It got more complicated because after 2 years on those meds, I was still stressed and unhappy, and the meds had made me gain about 40 pounds. And I remember I went to the doctor for a follow-up, and his response was to titrate the meds and see if it helped with my weight gain. And I essentially said, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to try to get better physically. So I left the doctor that day, joined a gym, I met with a trainer, laid out my long, complicated story, and probably overwhelmed his mind similarly how I'm doing to yours today. And I just made the decision to get better physically. So I went from weighing 260 pounds to 185 in about a year and a half. I work out in the gym 5 or 6 days a week now, and that's my outlet for stress. It's what keeps me in a good place. It helps me honestly regain some control. And after I lost the first 30 pounds, I weaned myself off all the medications, and I'm much happier with myself physically. The problem is, I think what I've discovered is I went from throwing myself into work to throwing myself into the gym just as a way to escape what was going on with my own mental health and not dealing with those consequences from the accident.
Well, and I'm not sure that others would have had the, the self willpower and determination, even if you had shifted your focus to something else, to be able to acknowledge that you needed to make a change. So I mean, I think that's commendable in and of itself with everything that was going on. And so,
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to control. It really, losing control in situations like this when you're in the hospital, I think, is one of the biggest things for family members. And so you find those things that you can control to give you kind of a sense of calm. And for me, that was, getting healthier physically.
so kind of at this point, it sounds like you're moving forward from the accident. I think you're trying to find some sort of semblance of, living kind of, as you said, your new normal. And kind of, what happened next?
Um, we a few years later had my first son, and I think Hudson became our way to feel like we had hope that we could overcome everything we had went through. And then, unfortunately, the nightmare just happened all over again. To make what's a very long and complicated story short, my son and I went grocery shopping for Thanksgiving while my wife was at work, and I came home from grocery shopping and got him out of the car seat, and uh, there was a cleaning crew at my house cleaning for prior to Thanksgiving, and I told the man with the cleaning crew, hey, my son's out of the car. Don't move your car. It was in my driveway because my son is out. And in a split second, as my back was turned, the gentleman, I guess, didn't hear me effectively. Got in the car, backed out, and made contact with my son. I knocked him over to the ground, and then he ran over both his legs and his pelvis with the car. Um, Everything else, uh, it parallels my wife's accident so much. I remember laying on the ground, just holding him, knowing in my mind something was wrong, but hoping it wasn't as bad as I was seeing in my head. But then it only took about 30 seconds for the medical part of me to kick in. There's a children's ED about 2 miles from my house, and I just got us there as quick as I could. And once we got there, everything went so fast. My wife was at work, and I was pretty hysterical, to be honest. Just the fear of not knowing exactly what was wrong. Um, what made the situation complicated was my wife was 7 weeks pregnant with our second son. So I knew when I had to pick up the phone and call her and tell her about this, I knew what that was going to do with her. And so I lived with this fear that if I didn't have all the right information to tell her he was okay, that I'd jeopardize our new baby's life because of the stress. Because my wife had lived this. So to have to tell her this was now happening to our son, it was just, I just couldn't believe it was happening.
So did everything that you experienced with your wife and her accident, did that help at all with how you handled, what happened from your son's accident, or was this just a completely different experience?
On an emotional level, I think it made it worse because you're reliving the same thing again. It's like you have to ask yourself, who has this freak accident happen again to the two most important people to them? From a pure healthcare perspective, my son's injuries ended up all being orthopedic after having some initial scares about internal injuries. He had complete and displaced breaks of his femur and tibia, as well as a broken pelvis. He went to surgery to have a spica cast that went from his nipples to the tips of his toes, and he wore that for about 8 weeks. But that also meant that a rambunctious 18-month-old was now completely bedbound and dependent on us for care. So, we had different stresses because one of us had to be with him at all times. The experience was also a complete 180 from my wife's hospital stay, and I think that's probably something about a children's hospital. Every provider was careful with their words. They were empathetic. They were caring. They were understanding. I remember being moved from the trauma bay into a regular ED room, and shortly after, I saw a lot of commotion going on outside, and someone came in. They told me that there was a very severe trauma coming in, and that it was going to require a lot of resources. But they wanted us to know that if we needed anything, that they could get someone in the room quickly. It was the same situation I had faced 4 years earlier, but the way the word choice was landed so much better, and didn't cause me any harm at all or any worry. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are still a few situations that stand out in my mind as not going the way I'd hoped, but they were nowhere like the failures we experienced with my wife. The ER physicians, nurses, especially the ED pharmacists that day, really worked hard to make sure we were okay and that my son was comfortable. About 8 months after my son's first accident, he tripped over our dog and broke his arm, while my wife was at work after I was unloading groceries, is the irony of it. And I had to go back to the same ER. And oddly, it was almost the exact same people that were working the day of my son's accident. And the moment they saw us, they remembered who we were. And that's just always stuck with me. They remembered who we were, and they continued to approach us with an even more gentle touch because they knew our story.
That had to have given you such a sense of calm or comfort, to know, like, to feel that compassion and empathy that the team is able to give you.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. That is a great example of taking a patient's personal story and using it to care for them.
So just with everything, from March, from your wife's accident up until, years later now, at a certain time during all of this, like, did you just reach a breaking point and just lose it? Thinking more of, like, kind of, emotionally, I can't imagine the flood of feelings and things that you probably had bottled up with all of this, because I'm sure trying to keep a not a straight face, but a calm and comforting, face and voice was probably something that you were at least trying to do during all of this.
Oh, absolutely. I think the day of the accident, that's always the most challenging day. With Hudson's accident, because it was all orthopedic, we were in the hospital just under 4 days. The day of was awful. I remember having to call my wife and tell her, and that was just one of the hardest moments. And I knew that she was going to try to get to where we were. The challenge was the children's hospital they were bringing us to was across the street from her. So I begged her not to leave. And so I think it's just another example of people jumping into action to help you who you don't expect. She was actually at work having lunch with one of the PGY1 residents, and that PGY1 dropped what she was doing, called someone, got coverage for her shift, drove my wife to the hospital, made sure she got there safe. She took my car from the hospital home, unloaded my groceries so I didn't lose all the food we had just bought. She drove me to the hospital and followed the ambulance because I was, an emotional wreck and couldn't drive. And then she stayed with us all day. I think that, that day she got to see my breaking point. And I think having her there, someone I didn't know that well at the time, and seeing them kind of have the emotional intelligence and the soft skills to be there for me and to be helpful to me is something I'm forever grateful for. I think, my problem, Nick, and I think what a lot of family members go through is they feel this pressure to be normal, and they feel this pressure because they're not the one going through the actual pain and the trauma. They feel the pressure to try to be as composed as possible and not to deal with what they're going through. And that's exactly what I did. I just tried to push everything aside and be strong.
So with, the effects from these accidents and everything that followed with it, it sounds like they, had some sort of long-term impact, on you. Now, what was kind of going through your head, after you left the hospital from Hudson's accident, and when did you realize maybe how much of a lasting impact that this might have on you and your family?
Again, I think in the immediate aftermath, I pushed it all aside. It was about a year after the accident when I started having to resolve the medical bills associated with his accident, and it's pretty much required me every day for 4 months to relive the day of the accident with attorneys or insurance agents or people from the hospital. And sometime during that, I just lost the ability to sleep at night. I lost the ability to close my eyes and not watch a car run my wife over and a car run my son over. And it took about 3 months of that happening consistently before I decided I just couldn't take it anymore.
So what did you do? How were you able to find help?
I think the first thing is admitting I had a problem. I knew those, 4 little letters of PTSD were going to come up in some doctor's discussion, and so I avoided it for so long because I didn't want to be defined by those 4 little letters. I started looking for psychologists that my insurance would cover because I'm fortunate enough that our insurance here covers 100% of outpatient mental health benefits. I would read about the doctor online, call their office, leave a message, and after about 15 phone calls and being told that they weren't taking new patients or it was going to be a year before I could get an appointment, I almost lost hope and gave up. But I made another list, and instead of researching doctors, I just called the next 10 doctors' offices on the list. And I finally found one that had an appointment in 3 months. I just remember thinking to myself, if this is what people who leave the hospital with issues go through in trying to get help, I can completely understand why most people never get it. In all, it took me 7 months of trying from the first day I started looking to get help to actually be able to see a psychologist who could help a person who had been through the things that I did. And I'm a 35-year-old healthcare professional with knowledge and resources. Just think about what somebody who doesn't have those things faces.
So were you at all scared of, the potential, negative perception of seeking help? Because, you mentioned you didn't necessarily want to be defined by those 4 letters. Was that something that really, until that point, did that make you not want to, seek help, and kind of more of, if you didn't, kind of denial rather than, and you can kind of put it under a rug?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we can all identify with is that, I've spent the last 10 years to build a name for myself within critical care pharmacy to accomplish my professional goals, to be known as a content expert in what I do. Honestly, as I've told you, as we've been discussing doing this, I'm terrified of what people will think of me now that I'm pretty much sending a wrecking ball through that professional image. That professional image is something that we all carefully craft on our own. It's what we want people to think of us, right? I don't want to be defined as that guy who told everybody he had PTSD, but I think what I've realized in getting ready to talk to you today is that I've been given an opportunity to do something that could be more impactful than any paper or presentation I could ever do. And that's why I'm choosing to talk about this, and I'm choosing to accept the risk of how some people may choose to respond to the things that I'm saying. My hope is that people hear them and understand how much better we can do for patients and families, and that's what's most important.
So what do you think you've learned from the whole process now that you've been able to really focus on dealing with and addressing the emotional impact of the the trauma that your family's experienced?
I think I was really naive to what treatment for this was like when I started. When I first started seeing the doctor, for some reason I thought the whole point was going to be to learn what triggered my episodes and how to avoid them. Avoidance was the key. But the reality is, what I've been working on is how to expose myself to these memories and it not elicit the same emotional response, or learning to focus on something outside of the memory that helps me control my response to it. So the reality is, talking to you today is just part of my recovery.
So you mentioned earlier that these experiences have changed the way that you practice as a critical care pharmacist. So what lessons did you learn from these experiences that you think that we, as pharmacists, just generally speaking, or even ICU multidisciplinary team members, can do to really help family members of our patients and prevent the same errors and gaps in communication that can cause these lasting negative impact?
Yeah, we could probably talk a whole hour about this, Nick, but to me there are really three important things that stand out. The first, every word that you say to a patient and their family matters, and every word can have long-term consequences. I've thought about this a lot over the last 2 days, especially because on Sunday my wife and I took the boys to the trampoline park, and we were having a ton of fun, laughing, jumping, and I just sat there for a minute and I watched my wife and my son jump, and I just marveled at how both of them were normal. Um, they both have permanent complications, but despite the broken bones and the trauma, they're jumping and having fun, just like a normal family. That's really the most amazing thing about working in medicine is I'm so incredibly thankful to the people who put my wife and my son's bodies back together. There will never be a day that I am not grateful for that. The flip side of that is that I feel like our dedication to saving lives doesn't negate the responsibility to communicate with patients and their families with compassion and empathy. We all get busy, we all have stresses, but we always have to remember the reason that we are here every day is the patient and their family in front of them. I just can't accept that we can only focus on step one of a huge process when there's so much more involved. The second thing that I would say is that I think we should all have a conscious effort, or make a conscious effort, to interact more with patients and their families. I remember the first version of your podcast I listened to was when Chris Drogi talked about critical care pharmacy, and he talked about that white paper. And something he said just really stuck out to me, because in that white paper he talks about how time for talking to patients and their families isn't an essential task, and that's a problem. It really should be one of the most essential things that we do as critical care pharmacists every day. I read a book recently called In Shock, by a doctor from Henry Ford who went through a severe trauma, and she uses that trauma to essentially tell people how much better we can get in healthcare. If anyone listening hasn't read it, it should be required reading for every healthcare professional. But there's a quote in it that I pulled because to me it's so impactful. Dr. Oddish in the book says, "We cannot change that which is true and sad, but we can acknowledge it. We can humbly witness suffering and offer support." That just really, stands out to me as how we should all work in our jobs as critical care pharmacists. Our job will never be relegated to standing in the hallway and making recommendations. If we really want to make those words a reality, I think it's going to take every single person on the healthcare team together taking action for things to get better. We should feel empowered to stop and talk to family members about medication changes that they hear us make on rounds. Sometimes hearing from the person who made the recommendation that was accepted may help them gain understanding and have a sense of control. I had an opportunity a few years ago to see a family in my unit struggling with this. And every day I would go in and talk to them about the medication changes that were happening for their son. And every day it would help them calm down and feel less anxious. I had an amazing opportunity about a year after they got out of our ICU to actually write an article for the Neurocritical Care Society with the patient's mother, who's a former high school English teacher, and it's a case that I'll never forget my entire career. I would say that the last thing I would reinforce to people is something we haven't talked about yet, but I think pharmacy, a lot of times we get labeled as only caring about cost. Cost can't control every decision we make, but from my own experience, the financial considerations have to be one of the most stressful things from the hospital stay for family members. Someone has to care about cost. If you've ever had the misfortune of having to go through a hospital bill line by line and see what people are billed, you'll do like I did, and you'll discover that that gentamicin level that got ordered on my wife because of her grade 3 open fractures was $400. I think that was eye opening for me because not only do we need to be stewards of our providers and ensuring that they're using the safest and most cost effective therapy, but we need to be stewards of ourselves and ensure that everything we're doing as a provider is actually needed because that can have financial implications for the patient that we don't understand.
And I think most, if not all of us, working in critical care have heard or have even said the phrase, and you mentioned that they said this to you on the very first night, remember to take care of yourself, to patients' family members. And I don't think this is meant to say that, to imply that we don't mean it. I think all of us genuinely do, but only recently, from when we were talking in November and the lead up into this, only recently did I realize that family members can really develop the same, mental health problems that, patients do when they're discharged. So was this something that, from your perspective, these problems or these issues, that did they come when still being in the hospital, or is this something that really happened, once you were out of the hospital and dealing with, like you mentioned, the financial aspects and everything else of, the steps after step one?
I think there's probably evidence to say it happens at both times. One of the things that Jimmy talked about was that we're still trying to figure out the right time to talk to patients and families about some of the mental and emotional things they may face. And since every hospital has completely different resources and some hospitals may not even be addressing this at all, those conversations may not happen. Every word you're hearing me speak today is 100% experience based. I've lived this. I think honestly it started in the hospital, but everything that was happening to me, I constantly had a distraction, another mountain to climb that didn't make me realize how severe it was. And then so once life got somewhat normal and we had our second son and my wife and my first son overcame their trauma, I was left without all those distractions. And it just kind of hit me like a freight train and made me realize how much these things had impacted me and how I had never really focused on myself in the way I should.
Now, during these hospital stays, were you ever offered any resources that talked about, PICS or PICS-F?
No, and I wasn't, and I think this was before FCCM had developed a lot of their resources, and so I knew the concepts existed, but there was nothing I really was offered or on my end sought out to help me. I've done a lot of reading about the subject now that I recognize the issues that I faced, but unfortunately, no, at the time I wasn't offered anything.
So Morgan, what made you want to come talk about this today? Because I think, trauma, this severe, this personal, I think many of us would be really uncomfortable talking about this at all, let alone on a podcast.
That's a question I've asked myself a lot since I agreed to do this, Nick. I just got to be honest with you. The week I got your email, I had just started talking to the doctor about outlets, outlets to express what I'd been through in a way that would help me, since we discovered that, my professional life was a way that I dealt with the stress positively in a personal life. And I remember talking to him about reading Dr. Aldish's book and him telling me that I should find some outlet to share my story, and that someone may hear it and be impacted in the same way that I was in reading her words. And literally, I think it was 2 days later, I got the email from you, and I just was kind of like, "Wow, I feel like this is a sign." The other thing I think it's an important conversation to have, and the other reason I think I'm willing to kind of be this vulnerable and talk about this, is that I kind of feel like our profession of pharmacy is at a crossroads. Um, we're talking a lot now about resilience and how we all need to be more resilient in the profession. And Nick, I really don't think resilience is a problem for me, and I don't think it's a problem for our students and our trainees at the moment. I think that's a misconception, because my generation and those ahead of me haven't really opened up about the obstacles we've faced and just how strong we've been through challenges. I'm certain I am not the only well established critical care pharmacist who's dealt with challenges like this. I just think we haven't talked about it. And I kind of view it this way: as the next generation of people is watching us now. The world operates differently with social media, and how they perceive our actions and the presence and that professional image that we put out there. I feel like we've got to get to a point where we show other people that this job is challenging, that we deal with challenges every day, and that sometimes life throws you curveballs that make it even harder. I think this really got reiterated to me when I recently watched a resident that I mentored who had an autoimmune condition let the stress of residency almost kill them, simply because they wanted to push forward. And I thought to myself, is this the example we're setting of letting people think that you have to sacrifice so many things to be perceived as resilient, and that if you ask for help, you're a failure? I don't think that's what we're putting out there, but it just makes me wonder if we keep talking about everybody needs to be more resilient, if we're just shying away from the real problem. My accomplishments don't go away because I'm admitting that I need help to figure out how to deal with the trauma I've witnessed. I think if we can start talking about obstacles like this, the odds we've overcome, then maybe we can finally get to a point where we realize resilience isn't the problem and start focusing on some of the other systematic failures that face medical practice today.
What is, hopefully there are lots and lots of things that people are able to take away and really, think about and dwell on and really work to improve. But, what do you hope that the audience takes away or learns from your story?
You know, I hope everyone has stayed on and has listened through this to the end, because it's a story that sounds unique, but unfortunately, I think we all know that it's not. Since Jimmy mentioned that, and as I mentioned at the beginning, 1 out of every 3 family members develop symptoms just like mine. And I think that's a number we have to remember and we have to start doing something about. I think stories highlighting some of the things that impact each other and people that we've worked with that we don't think about in our jobs every day, people hearing my story, I hope is helpful to them. I hope that someone hears this and understands that it's okay to struggle and that it's okay to ask for help. And more importantly, I really hope someone hears this and just says to themselves, we can do better. We can do better for patients. We can do better for their families. And Jimmy really is right. Helping the patient survive is only step one, and I think there's a big role that we can play, even as ICU pharmacists, to helping shift the focus off of just step one and on to all the other things that happen afterwards. And I'm really grateful. This has been a hard conversation to have, but I'm very grateful for you giving me this opportunity and allowing me to talk about these things in a way that helps someone understand where we can do better.
I mean, Morgan, thank you for trusting me to share your story. This touched me in ways I'm sure that you couldn't imagine, and I know it's going to change the way that I practice moving forward. And to me, the strength and courage that you have to talk about this in such a public forum and able to help others is inspiring. It really is. If any listeners, want to get in touch with you and reach out about how your story impacted them, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I do have a semi presence on Twitter. My It's at gmjones09. And then I can be reached via email at morgan.jones@mlh.org. Hopefully, someone hears these things and is definitely impacted in a way that helps them understand that they can get out of bed the next day and make interacting with patients and families an essential part of their day. And for me, that I think is what's going to be the single most impactful thing I can do in my career.
I know it's going to impact people. So thank you, Morgan. Thank you. For anyone listening who is impacted, please reach out and let Morgan know that, because the courage to come on and talk about that is just awe-inspiring to me. And I want to get a little sentimental here at the end and just say thank you to everybody, to families, friends, colleagues, peers, listeners, everyone. Just thank you from the bottom of my heart, because as of today, we're recording this in mid-January. This podcast has over 12,000 downloads, and I am genuinely speechless. When one of you sends a kind note, emails me, sends me a direct message, leaves a review, I promise I read, each and every one of them. And it means so much to me to have the opportunity to bring some of these issues to light and talk to just really incredible, guests within the world of critical care and pharmacy. So thank you all so much. It means so much. And we have a few big things in the works for the next couple months, and we'll get into more and letting you know some about those things on our next episode. Please, as always, get in touch via Twitter or Instagram. That's at PharmacyToDose, TO2Dose, or via email, PharmacyToDose@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Nick Peters, and this is Pharmacy to Dose, the Critical Care Podcast.